The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor as my husband's words echoed through our anniversary party. Brad grabbed the microphone with a drunken grin, looked directly at me, and announced to our 100 guests, "You're boring, Lucy. I want someone younger. Something new. Pack your bags tomorrow and get out of my house." That's when I realized he'd forgotten one tiny detail. Comment your city below and subscribe. Ready for an amazing story? Let's begin. Let me take you back to how we got here, because trust me, this story is worth every second. 3 months earlier, I started noticing the signs. My husband of 20 years, Brad Taylor, had suddenly developed an interest in working late and important client meetings that somehow always involved his 28-year-old secretary, Amber. You know the type, blonde, perky, and about as deep as a puddle in Arizona. I'm Lucy Morrison, 52 years old, and I didn't build a multi-million-dollar tech company by being naive. Morrison Tech Solutions wasn't some cute little side business. It was an empire. While other wives my age were posting yoga selfies on social media, I was closing deals that would make Wall Street executives weep with envy. But apparently, success doesn't protect you from having a midlife crisis husband who thinks trading up means trading down in brain cells. The signs were embarrassingly obvious. New cologne that smelled like desperation mixed with teenage boy spray. Gym memberships he actually used, which was suspicious since Brad's idea of exercise had always been reaching for the TV remote. And my personal favorite, him asking our housekeeper Maria if she thought his hair looked too mature for a man his age. Maria, bless her, told me everything. I hired a private investigator because I'm thorough, not paranoid. The photos confirmed what I already knew. Brad and Amber were having more intimate client meetings than any business relationship required. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, even a weekend getaway to Napa that Brad claimed was a solo retreat for professional development. Right. The only thing he was developing professionally was his technique in betrayal. So when Brad planned our 20th anniversary party, inviting everyone we knew to the house I owned, celebrating with champagne I paid for, I decided to let him have his moment. I watched him drink too much, get too comfortable, and make the biggest mistake of his pathetic little life. Because Brad had forgotten something crucial about our arrangement. I owned everything. The house, the business, the cars, even the designer suits he wore to impress his little girlfriend. 20 years ago, when we got married, I was already successful. Brad was a charming but broke marketing guy who brought nothing to the table except good looks and empty promises. Every asset was in my name, every business decision went through me, and every penny he spent came from accounts I controlled. As I stood there watching him humiliate me in front of everyone we knew, I felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. Brad wanted someone new? He was about to discover exactly how new his life could become. Starting tomorrow, when he realized that the boring wife he was kicking out owned the house he was standing in. The microphone was still in his hand when I walked over with my most dangerous smile. "Honey," I said sweetly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you forgot one tiny detail. I own everything." His face went white as reality hit him like a freight train carrying divorce papers. But that was just the beginning of Brad's very expensive education in what happens when you mess with Lucy Morrison. And trust me, by the time I was finished with him, he'd learned that boring wives sometimes have the most interesting revenge stories. The silence that followed my words was absolutely delicious. 100 guests stood frozen like they were playing the world's most awkward game of statue, their champagne glasses halfway to their lips, their eyes darting between Brad and me like they were watching a tennis match where someone just pulled out a chainsaw instead of a racket. Brad's face went through more color changes than a mood ring in a thunderstorm. First white, then red, then a sickly green that matched the envy I was about to inspire in every wronged woman in that room. He tried to laugh it off, that nervous little chuckle he used whenever he'd been caught in a lie about where he'd been or why his credit card showed charges at jewelry stores I'd never visited. "Lucy, honey, you're being dramatic," he said, still holding the microphone like it might somehow save him from the hole he'd dug himself into. "This is our house. We built this together." Oh, sweet, delusional Brad. Even in his panic, he couldn't help himself from lying. "Actually, darling," I replied, my voice carrying across the silent room like silk over steel, This is my house. Just like Morrison Tech is my company, and just like that Porsche in the driveway is my car. The one you've been using to drive your secretary to those cozy little hotel meetings. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Actually, you could have heard a feather drop on a cloud. Our guests were getting more entertainment than they'd bargained for, and honestly, they looked like they were enjoying it more than any anniversary party they'd ever attended. Amber, the secretary in question, was standing by the bar looking like she wanted to dissolve into the marble floor. Poor little thing probably thought she was seducing a wealthy businessman, not realizing she was just getting the leftovers from a very successful woman's table. Her red dress, which I now noticed was remarkably similar to one I'd worn to a board meeting last month, seemed to be losing its confidence along with its wearer. "Lucy, can we talk about this privately?" Brad whispered urgently, finally lowering the microphone. He was starting to sweat, and not just from the alcohol. Reality was sobering him up faster than a cold shower in an ice storm. "Oh no, sweetie," I said, taking the microphone from his trembling hands. "You made this public, so let's keep it public. Everyone here tonight is our friends and business associates. They deserve to know the truth about our marriage, don't you think?" I looked out at the crowd, recognizing faces from our company, our country club, our entire social circle. These people had watched us build our life together, or rather, they'd watched me build our life while Brad took credit for it. Time for some truth in advertising. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "thank you all for coming to celebrate 20 years of marriage with us. It's been quite a journey. 20 years ago, I started Morrison Tech Solutions with $50,000 and a dream. Today, it's worth $37 million. Brad here," I gestured toward my soon-to-be ex-husband, "has been my biggest supporter and my most expensive dependent." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. They weren't sure if this was part of some elaborate anniversary roast, or if they were witnessing the most public divorce announcement in social history. "But, apparently," I continued, 20 years of supporting his career, paying for his lifestyle, and apparently being too boring for his refined tastes, means it's time for me to pack my bags. So I have an announcement to make." Brad grabbed my arm. "Lucy, please, you're drunk. You don't know what you're saying." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back at his face with the kind of smile that would make a shark nervous. "Actually, Brad, I'm completely sober. I stopped drinking 3 hours ago when I decided to file for divorce tomorrow morning." The gasps from our guests were almost musical. Amber made a sound like a deflating balloon, and Brad's face went through that color-changing routine again. But I wasn't finished yet. "The real announcement is this. Effective immediately, Brad Taylor is no longer employed by Morrison Tech Solutions. His company credit cards are canceled, his access to company accounts is revoked, and his company car needs to be returned by Monday morning." I paused, savoring the moment. "Oh, and Brad? That boring wife you just publicly humiliated? She's keeping the house." That's when things got really interesting, because Brad finally realized he wasn't just losing a wife. He was about to lose everything that had made him feel important for the past 20 years. And judging by the look on his face, that education was going to be more painful than he'd ever imagined. The aftermath of my little announcement was better than any reality TV show ever produced. Our guests didn't know whether to applaud, run for the exits, or start taking bets on whether Brad would faint right there on my Italian marble floors. Honestly, I was hoping for the fainting. It would have made excellent footage for my lawyer. Brad, to his credit, tried to rally. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie, the expensive one I'd bought him for Christmas, and attempted what I can only describe as damage control. "Folks, my wife has had a little too much champagne tonight. You know how emotional women get during these milestone anniversaries." Oh, he did not just say that. In front of a room full of successful businesswomen, including 3 CEOs, 2 federal judges, and my attorney Margaret Walsh, who happened to specialize in high-asset divorces. The man had a death wish. "Emotional?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a sword about to drop. "You mean like the emotion I felt when I found the receipts for your romantic weekend with Amber? Or the emotion I experienced discovering you've been using my company credit card to buy her jewelry? That kind of emotional?" The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in people's drinks. Amber looked like she was considering making a run for it, which honestly would have been smart. I had hotel surveillance photos, credit card statements, and enough evidence to turn this little anniversary gathering into a very public airing of dirty laundry. "Lucy, you're being unreasonable," Brad said, but his voice had lost its bravado. He was starting to understand that this wasn't some temporary tantrum he could smooth over with flowers and fake apologies. "We can work this out. Marriage is about forgiveness." "You're absolutely right," I agreed sweetly. "Marriage is about forgiveness. It's also about trust, respect, and not sleeping with your secretary while your wife is building the empire that pays for your lifestyle." Margaret Walsh stepped forward, because excellent attorneys have perfect timing. "Mrs. Morrison, perhaps we should discuss the details privately?" "Actually, Margaret, I think our guests deserve to understand the full situation," I replied. "After all, many of them are business partners, and they need to know about some changes at Morrison Tech." I looked around the room, making eye contact with our most important clients and investors. These were people who'd built relationships with our company, not with Brad specifically. Time to clarify some business arrangements. As of Monday morning, all client relationships will be handled directly through me or my management team. Brad's departure from the company will be seamless because, well, he never actually managed any accounts anyway. His primary responsibility for the past 5 years has been attending networking events and looking handsome at business dinners. That got a few chuckles from the crowd, especially from Carol Zhang, who ran one of our biggest client accounts and had frequently complained about Brad's lack of technical knowledge during project meetings. 20 years of building an empire, and you thought I'd just hand you the keys?" I continued, looking directly at Brad. "Darling, you never held the keys. You just rode in the passenger seat while I drove us to success." Brad's face was getting redder by the minute. "This is humiliating, Lucy. These people respect me." "Actually," interrupted David Kim from Pacific Investment Group, "we respect your wife. Brad, no offense, but we all knew who really ran Morrison Tech. Lucy's the one we trust with our business." Several other guests nodded in agreement. Brad looked around the room, finally realizing that his professional reputation had been built entirely on my success. Without me, he was just another middle-aged guy with a receding hairline and a midlife crisis girlfriend. "Fine," Brad said, his voice tight with anger. "Keep your precious company. I'll start my own business. I have contacts, experience, knowledge about your clients." Margaret Walsh cleared her throat meaningfully. "Actually, Mr. Taylor, the non-compete clause in your employment contract prevents you from starting a competing business for 3 years. And the confidentiality agreement prohibits you from discussing client information with anyone outside Morrison Tech." Brad's jaw dropped. "I never signed any non-compete agreement." "You signed it in 2019 when you received your last promotion," Margaret replied smoothly, "along with a revised confidentiality agreement and a clause stating that all company assets, including the company car and credit cards, would be returned immediately upon termination." I smiled at my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, with genuine affection. Not for him, but for Margaret's thoroughness. "So you see, honey, you're not just unemployed. You're unemployable in our industry for the next 3 years." That's when Brad finally lost it completely, and our anniversary party turned into the most expensive temper tantrum anyone in attendance had ever witnessed. But this was exactly the kind of public meltdown I needed for divorce court. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving someone enough rope to hang themselves with, then selling tickets to watch the show. After our guests left, and trust me, they were practically racing to their cars to call their friends and spill the tea about the Morrison marriage explosion, I found myself alone with Brad for the first time all evening. He was sitting on my leather couch, head in his hands, looking like a man who'd just realized he'd traded a winning lottery ticket for a handful of pretty rocks. "Lucy," he started, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." "Oh, now you want to talk?" I kicked off my heels and poured myself a proper drink. Not the champagne we'd been serving our guests, but the good whiskey from the bottle he'd never touched because he preferred beer. 20 years too late for conversation, don't you think? He looked up at me with those puppy dog eyes that had worked so well when we were 20-something kids planning our future together. Back when I was naive enough to think love conquered all and stupid enough to believe his promises about being partners in everything. "This isn't how I wanted things to end," he said. "End?" I laughed, settling into the chair across from him. "Oh, sweetie, this isn't an ending. This is just the first act of a very long, very expensive education you're about to receive." Brad flinched. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and opened the folder labeled Project Brad's Reality Check. Yes, I actually named it that. After building a tech empire, I've learned the value of good organizational systems. Well, let's see, I said, scrolling through my notes. We've already covered your unemployment situation, but there are so many other interesting details to discuss. Like the fact that your Porsche is a company car? Registered under Morrison Tech. It'll need to be returned Monday morning. His face went white. Lucy, that car is not yours? Never was. Just like this house isn't yours. The country club membership isn't yours. And that platinum credit card you've been using to wine and dine your little girlfriend isn't yours either. I stood up and walked to my home office, returning with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. This is what 20 years of supporting a husband looks like in financial terms. Every car payment, every credit card bill, every vacation, every golf membership, every single expense. All tracked, all documented, all paid by me. Brad stared at the folder like it contained his death sentence. Which, financially speaking, it kind of did. Here's my personal favorite, I continued, pulling out a specific set of receipts. Your romantic weekend in Napa with Amber? You charged it to my American Express card. The hotel suite, the couple's massage, even the jewelry you bought her. You literally used my money to cheat on me. I can explain. Oh, please do. I'm dying to hear how you're going to explain using my credit card to buy another woman a $3,000 necklace. Brad opened his mouth, then closed it again. Even he wasn't shameless enough to try to justify that particular betrayal. The thing is, Brad, I said, settling back into my chair with my whiskey, I've been planning this conversation for 3 months, ever since I hired Jackson Investigations to document your extracurricular activities. Did you know you've been to the Fairmont Hotel 12 times since January? Always with Amber, always on Tuesday afternoons, always charged to company expenses as client meetings. He looked sick. How long have you known? Long enough to prepare. Long enough to move all the important assets into accounts you can't touch. Long enough to have our prenuptial agreement reviewed by the best divorce attorney in the state. Prenup? Brad's voice cracked. We don't have a prenuptial agreement. I smiled, the kind of smile that would make a loan shark proud. Actually, we do. You signed it in 2019, remember? When I updated our estate planning after Morrison Tech's big expansion. You signed so many papers that day, and you were so excited about the new Porsche I was buying you I don't think you read them very carefully. That wasn't entirely accurate. We'd updated our wills and financial arrangements, but I'd been very careful about the language. My attorney had been quite creative with the clauses about asset protection and business interests. You tricked me? I protected myself. There's a difference. Brad stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked our swimming pool and perfectly manicured gardens. Everything he was looking at represented years of my work, my success, my money. And now he was finally understanding that none of it had ever really belonged to him. So what happens now? He asked. Now you learn what it's like to be a 50-year-old unemployed man with no assets, no income, and no prospects. While I learn what it's like to be a 52-year-old woman with $37 million and no dead weight dragging down my happiness. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message that changed everything. Because it turned out Brad's betrayal was just the beginning of this story. And some secrets run much deeper than cheating husbands and ambitious secretaries. Range from the text message was from an unknown number, but the words made my blood freeze. We need to talk about Morrison Tech's real ownership structure. Meet me at Starbucks on 5th Street tomorrow at 10 a.m. Come alone. A friend who knows about Swiss accounts. Swiss accounts? I stared at the message, reading it 3 times before my brain could process what I was seeing. Brad noticed my expression immediately because despite being an unfaithful moron, he'd always been good at reading my moods. What is it? He asked, moving closer to look at my phone. I pulled it away instinctively. Nothing that concerns you anymore. But it did concern him, didn't it? Swiss accounts meant hidden money. Hidden money meant someone had been moving Morrison Tech assets without my knowledge. And the only person with any access to company finances besides me was sitting right there on my couch, looking guilty as sin about more than just his secretary. Brad, I said slowly, is there anything else you need to tell me? About the company? About our finances? About anything I might discover during divorce proceedings? He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. I don't know what you mean. I said, standing up and walking to my wall safe behind the Monet painting, that I'm about to have forensic accountants crawl through every single financial record of our marriage and our business. If there's anything else you've been hiding, now would be the time to come clean. I opened the safe and pulled out our financial documents, spreading them across the coffee table. Bank statements, investment portfolios, business accounts, everything I thought I knew about our financial situation. The house, the company, the cars, even the air you breathe belongs to me, I said, studying the papers with new suspicion. But apparently there are some things I don't know about yet. Brad's face had gone through so many color changes tonight. I was starting to worry he might stroke out before I could get the truth from him. Lucy, there are some complications. Complications? My voice could have frozen lava. What kind of complications? He sat back down heavily, like a man preparing to confess to murder. The Swiss account isn't mine. I mean, it is, but it isn't. It's God. This is going to sound terrible. Try me. After tonight, my tolerance for terrible has expanded considerably. Your business partner, James Richardson, approached me 2 years ago. He said he'd found some inconsistencies in Morrison Tech's international accounts. Money that should have been going to the IRS was being redirected. My heart stopped. James Richardson had been my business partner for 15 years. He handled our European contracts while I focused on domestic growth. I'd trusted him with millions of dollars in international business. Redirected where? Offshore accounts, Swiss banks, Cayman Islands, places where the IRS can't track business income. James said everyone does it, that it was standard practice for tech companies our size. I felt like I was falling through the floor. How much money, Brad? I don't know exactly. James said it was about 40% of our international revenue over the past 5 years. 40% of our international revenue over 5 years would be approximately $14 million. $14 million that should have been company assets, that should have been declared income, that should have been mine. And your role in this was what exactly? I signed documents. James said they needed my signature as company vice president for the international account transfers. He said you knew about it, but preferred to maintain plausible deniability for tax purposes. I closed my eyes, feeling 20 years of careful business building crumbling around me. Not only had my husband been cheating on me, but he'd been helping my business partner steal from me. The 2 men I'd trusted most in the world had been systematically betraying me. James told you I knew about this? He said you'd set up the whole system, that you were the one who decided which profits to declare and which to hide. He said it was your idea to keep me out of the direct loop, so if anything went wrong, you could claim ignorance of my involvement. The beautiful, horrible irony was almost funny. James had convinced Brad that I was the mastermind of our own theft, while convincing me that Brad was just a harmless figurehead with no real business knowledge. He'd been playing us against each other for years. My phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. James thinks you don't know about the accounts yet. He's wrong. Tomorrow we discuss how much you want to recover and how much you want him to lose. I looked at Brad. Sitting there looking pathetic and confused and guilty. He'd been a pawn in someone else's game, just like I had been. The difference was that I was about to stop being anyone's pawn. Brad, I said quietly, you have a choice to make. You can help me get my money back and expose James Richardson, or you can go down with him as an accomplice to fraud, because tomorrow morning I'm going to find out exactly how deep this betrayal goes. That's when I realized that my cheating husband was actually the least of my problems. Someone had been stealing from me for years, and they'd just made their first mistake. They'd revealed themselves right when I was angry enough to burn down everything in my path to get justice. This was going to be interesting. Lucy's Revenge Story, Chapters 6 and 10. I barely slept that night, my mind racing between Brad's confession about the Swiss accounts and the mysterious text messages. By morning, I'd consumed enough coffee to power a small aircraft and had already called my forensic accountant, my attorney, and my private investigator. If James Richardson thought he could steal $14 million from me and get away with it, He was about to learn why I'd built Morrison Tech from nothing. The Starbucks on 5th Street was buzzing with the usual morning crowd of caffeine-dependent office workers. But I spotted my mystery contact immediately. She was sitting in the corner booth, mid-60s, silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, wearing a Chanel suit that cost more than most people's cars. She looked like she belonged at a board meeting, not a clandestine coffee shop meeting. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, standing to shake my hand. "I'm Victoria Chen, former CFO of Richardson International Holdings." The pieces clicked into place instantly. James's previous company, the one that had gone bankrupt 3 years before he joined Morrison Tech. The bankruptcy that had made him available to become my business partner in the first place. "Former CFO," I repeated, settling into the booth across from her. "Let me guess, you discovered some creative accounting practices?" Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I discovered that James Richardson has a very specific pattern of operation. He targets successful companies with trusting partners, embeds himself in their financial operations, and systematically diverts funds to offshore accounts. You're not his first victim, Mrs. Morrison. You're his fourth." My blood turned to ice water. His fourth? Richardson International was originally Hartley Tech Solutions. Before that, Pacific Innovation Group. Before that, Coastal Consulting Services. Each time the pattern is identical. He partners with successful entrepreneurs, gains their trust, moves money offshore, then disappears when the companies collapse under the financial strain. I stared at this woman, trying to process what she was telling me. "But Morrison Tech isn't collapsing. We're successful, profitable." "Are you?" Victoria pulled out a tablet and showed me financial documents. "These are your real international accounts, Mrs. Morrison. The ones James has been managing without your oversight." The numbers on the screen made my stomach drop through the floor. Our European revenue streams showed massive gaps, unexplained transfers, and account balances that were 70% lower than what James had been reporting to me. "This can't be right," I whispered, scrolling through the documents. "We just signed the Brennan Industries contract for $12 million. That money should be sitting in an account in Geneva that you don't have access to," Victoria finished, "along with approximately $32 million in other diverted funds over the past 5 years. $32 million. Not 14, like Brad had thought. $32 million that James had stolen while I trusted him to handle our international growth. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "What's your interest in exposing him?" Victoria's expression hardened. "Because James Richardson destroyed my company and my reputation. When Richardson International collapsed, I was blamed for the financial irregularities. I spent 3 years fighting federal charges. Lost my house, my retirement, my marriage. I was cleared eventually, but my life was ruined." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing with the kind of anger that comes from years of planning revenge. "I've been tracking him ever since, documenting his pattern, gathering evidence. When he surfaced as your business partner, I knew it was just a matter of time. And you've been watching Morrison Tech for 5 years? I've been building a case that will put James Richardson in federal prison for the rest of his life. The problem is, I need someone with standing to file the complaint, someone who's been directly victimized and has the resources to pursue prosecution." I understood immediately. She needed me to be the face of the case against James to legitimize her evidence with my financial losses. In exchange, she was offering me the roadmap to recover my stolen money. "What exactly are you proposing?" Victoria smiled, and I realized this woman was even more dangerous than I was. "I'm proposing we destroy James Richardson so completely that he'll spend his remaining years in a federal penitentiary, watching his stolen money get returned to his victims." She handed me a business card with just a phone number on it. "Think about it, Mrs. Morrison, but don't think too long. James is planning to disappear within the next 2 weeks. He's already started liquidating the Geneva accounts." As she stood to leave, Victoria paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Morrison, your husband isn't the only person James has been manipulating. You might want to ask yourself how he knew so much about your marriage troubles before you discovered them yourself." That sentence hit me like a physical blow, because Victoria was right. James had been remarkably unsurprised when I told him about Brad's affair. He'd even suggested some excellent divorce attorneys, almost like he'd been expecting this conversation. I sat in that Starbucks for another hour, staring at Victoria's business card and realizing that everything I thought I knew about my life had been carefully orchestrated by someone I'd trusted completely. James hadn't just stolen my money. He'd been manipulating my entire marriage, positioning himself to be my trusted advisor when my world fell apart. But James Richardson had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that a betrayed wife would be too emotional and too distracted to think clearly. He hadn't considered that some women get more dangerous when they're angry, not less. Time to show him exactly how dangerous a woman with nothing left to lose could be. By the time I got home from my meeting with Victoria, I'd made 3 decisions. First, I was going to destroy James Richardson so thoroughly that his name would become synonymous with corporate fraud. Second, I was going to recover every penny he'd stolen from me, with interest. Third, I was going to enjoy every single moment of watching him realize he'd picked the wrong woman to underestimate. Brad was still living in my house, a situation I was about to remedy, but he was avoiding me like I had a contagious disease. He'd spent the night in the guest room and was now hiding in the kitchen, probably hoping I'd cooled down overnight. Poor, deluded Brad. I hadn't cooled down. I'd crystallized into something much more dangerous. "We need to talk," I announced, walking into the kitchen where he was nervously drinking coffee and scrolling through job listings on his phone. "Lucy, about last night." "Last night was just the opening act," I interrupted. "Today, we're going to discuss your starring role in James Richardson's theft operation." Brad's phone clattered to the counter. "I already told you everything I know." "No, you told me what James wanted you to know, but Victoria Chen just explained a few things that James forgot to mention." I pulled out my laptop and opened the files Victoria had shared with me. Bank routing numbers, account transfers, signature authorizations, all bearing Brad's electronic signature alongside James's. "According to these documents, you've been authorizing international transfers for the past 3 years, transfers totaling $32 million to accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg." Brad stared at the screen like he was looking at evidence of his own execution, which, legally speaking, he kind of was. "I thought those were legitimate business transfers," he stammered. "James said they were for tax optimization, international holding companies. Standard business practices." "Brad," I said with the patience of someone explaining basic math to a toddler, "you authorized the transfer of $32 million without asking me a single question. $32 million from a company you supposedly helped manage." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock I'd inherited from my grandmother. The same grandmother who'd taught me that trust was earned, not given, and that men who were too handsome for their own intelligence were often trouble. "James said you knew," Brad repeated weakly. "He said it was your strategy for international growth. And you believed him because it was easier than admitting you had no idea what was happening in my company." I closed the laptop and studied my soon-to-be ex-husband's face. 20 years of marriage, and I was finally seeing him clearly. Not the charming man I'd fallen in love with, not the supportive partner I'd thought I'd married, but a weak, lazy man who'd been content to coast on my success while signing whatever papers were put in front of him. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "You're going to help me prove that James Richardson committed fraud, or you're going to prison as his accomplice. Those are your only options. Lucy, I can't testify against James. He'll say I was a willing participant." "You were a willing participant," I pointed out. "You signed the authorization documents. The question is whether you were a victim of his manipulation or a co-conspirator in theft. That determination depends entirely on how cooperative you are." Brad slumped against the kitchen counter like a deflated balloon. "What do you want me to do?" "First, you're going to wear a wire when you meet with James. Second, you're going to get him to explain the entire operation on tape. Third, you're going to help federal investigators access those offshore accounts. And if I do all that, then you get immunity from prosecution and a small settlement in our divorce. If you don't, you get federal fraud charges and nothing from me except a front-row seat to your own destruction." My phone buzzed with a text message from James. "Heard about the anniversary party drama. Want to meet for lunch today? Time to discuss your future without Brad dragging down the company." The timing was so perfect it was almost poetic. James thought he was swooping in to comfort the betrayed wife, positioning himself as my reliable business partner during my personal crisis. He had no idea that I knew about the missing $32 million, or that his helpful concern was about to become evidence in a federal fraud case. Actually, I told Brad, showing him the text, I think lunch sounds perfect, but you're coming with me, and you're going to be very, very careful about what you say. Because James Richardson was about to discover that some women don't cry when their world falls apart. Some women pick up the pieces, sharpen them into weapons, and use them to cut down everyone who contributed to the destruction. He wanted to discuss my future without Brad? Fine. Let's discuss his future in federal prison. The restaurant James had chosen for our lunch meeting was one of those overpriced downtown places where tech executives went to make deals and impress clients. He was already seated at a corner table, looking perfectly composed in his Italian suit and wearing the kind of confident smile that made me want to slap him across his lying face. "Lucy," he said, standing to embrace me like the concerned friend he was pretending to be. "I'm so sorry about last night, Brad's behavior was absolutely inexcusable. If only he knew that Brad's cheating was now the least of my problems. "Thank you, James," I replied, settling into my chair and accepting the wine he'd already ordered. It's been a challenging 24 hours. Brad was sitting across from me, wearing the wire the FBI had provided that morning. Yes, the FBI. Turns out Victoria Chen hadn't been exaggerating about federal charges. When I'd called the number on her business card at 6 a.m., I'd been transferred to Agent Sarah Morrison, no relation, despite the name, who'd been investigating James Richardson for 2 years. "I have to say," James continued, cutting into his salmon with surgical precision, "this might be the best thing that could have happened to Morrison Tech. Brad has been dead weight for years." I nearly choked on my wine. The audacity of this man, sitting here bad-mouthing my husband while he'd been stealing millions from my company, was almost impressive in its sheer scope. "Dead weight?" I repeated, glancing at Brad, who looked like he was about to be sick. "Come on, Lucy. You and I both know Brad never contributed anything meaningful to the business. He's been coasting on your success, using company resources for personal expenses, taking credit for work he didn't do." Each accusation was technically accurate, which made it even more infuriating coming from someone who'd been embezzling my money for 5 years. "That's quite an assessment," I said carefully. "It's the truth." James leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "And now that he's out of the picture, we can restructure the company more efficiently. I've been thinking about this for months." Of course he had. Victoria had warned me that James always had an exit strategy, always positioned himself to take control when his partner's life imploded. "What kind of restructuring?" I asked. "Well, obviously you'll need some time to recover from the divorce proceedings. These things can be emotionally draining, financially complicated. Maybe you should consider taking a step back from day-to-day operations." There it was, the setup. James positioning himself as the caring partner who'd shoulder the burden while I dealt with my personal crisis. Meanwhile, he'd gained complete control of Morrison Tech and finished looting whatever assets remained. "Step back?" I repeated. "Temporarily, of course. Just until you're back on your feet emotionally. I could handle the international accounts, client relationships, major decisions. You could focus on healing." Brad was staring at his untouched lunch, probably realizing that James had been planning to push him out and manipulate me all along. The man really had been a pawn in someone else's game. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said. "But I'm curious about something. The international accounts you mentioned, how exactly have they been performing?" James's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Exceptionally well. Our European revenue streams are stronger than ever. And the Brennan Industries contract? How much was that worth again?" $12 million, paid in full last month, already deposited in our primary international holding account. He was lying so smoothly, so confidently, that I almost admired his technique. If I hadn't known about the missing money, I would have believed him completely. "James," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand, "I need to ask you something important. As my business partner, as my friend, have you ever done anything that could jeopardize Morrison Tech?" "Lucy, what kind of question is that?" "The kind of question a woman asks when federal investigators inform her that $32 million has been transferred from her company accounts to offshore holdings without her knowledge." James's face went completely white. His wine glass trembled in his hand, and for the first time since I'd known him, his composure cracked. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "Agent Morrison from the FBI was very thorough in her explanation," I continued conversationally. "Apparently, there's been a pattern of unusual transfers, unauthorized account access, and some very creative bookkeeping in our international operations." Brad was watching this exchange like a tennis match, probably realizing that he was witnessing the moment James Richardson's carefully constructed world began to collapse. "Lucy, there's been some kind of mistake." "The only mistake," I interrupted, "was trusting you with my company's financial future. But don't worry, James. That mistake is about to be corrected very, very thoroughly." That's when James realized he wasn't having lunch with a grieving, distracted woman going through a divorce. He was having lunch with someone who'd discovered his theft and was about to make him pay for every stolen dollar. The look of terror that crossed his face was almost worth the $32 million he'd stolen. Almost. What happened next was something I hadn't expected, something that changed everything I thought I knew about James Richardson's operation. As I watched him realize that his carefully constructed fraud was unraveling, James did something that caught me completely off guard. He laughed. Not nervous laughter, not the panicked chuckle of a man whose crimes had been discovered. He threw back his head and laughed with genuine amusement, like I'd just told him the funniest joke he'd heard all year. "Oh, Lucy," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "You magnificent, brilliant woman. Do you have any idea how long I've been waiting for this conversation?" Brad and I exchanged confused glances. This was not the reaction of a man who'd just been caught stealing millions of dollars. "I'm sorry," I said. 5 years, James continued, still chuckling. 5 years of waiting for you to discover the transfers, to confront me, to finally ask the right questions. Do you know how frustrating it's been, watching you trust me so completely when I've been practically begging you to investigate?" My blood turned to ice water. "What are you talking about?" James pulled out his phone and showed me a banking app. "The Geneva account that supposedly contains your stolen money? Look at it." I stared at the screen showing an account balance of $32,400,000. All there, every penny, sitting in an account marked Morrison Tech Holdings, L. Morrison, primary beneficiary. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Lucy, I didn't steal your money. I saved it." The restaurant seemed to tilt sideways. "Saved it from what?" "From your husband and his gambling addiction." Brad's face went white as paper. I don't have a gambling problem." James turned to look at him with something approaching pity. "Brad, you owe $430,000 to 3 different casinos. You've been using Morrison Tech's domestic accounts to cover your losses for the past 2 years. Lucy, did you ever wonder why your quarterly profits were always slightly lower than projected?" I felt like I was drowning. That's impossible. I review all the domestic accounts myself." "You review the statements Brad prepared for you," James corrected gently. "The same statements he's been doctoring to hide the missing funds." He pulled out a tablet and showed me real-time banking records. Morrison Tech's actual domestic accounts, showing massive withdrawals, transfers to gambling sites, payments to collection agencies. The offshore accounts weren't theft, Lucy. They were protection. I've been moving international revenue out of domestic accounts that Brad could access, storing it safely until I could figure out how to expose his embezzlement without destroying you in the process. Brad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. I'm not listening to these accusations." "Sit down, Brad," I said quietly. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else. "The gambling debts, the affair with Amber, the public humiliation at your anniversary party," James continued. "I've been documenting everything, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to show you who your husband really is." He handed me another folder, this one containing bank records, casino receipts, loan agreements, and photographs of Brad entering gambling establishments I'd never heard of. 5 years of watching you pour your heart into building Morrison Tech, while Brad systematically stole from you to fund his addiction. Do you know how many times I wanted to tell you? How many times I wanted to just transfer the offshore money back and let you discover his theft for yourself? I stared at the evidence spread across the table, my mind reeling. "Why didn't you?" Because I was in love with you." The words hung in the air between us like a live grenade. Brad sank back into his chair, looking like a man who just watched his execution. 5 years of being your business partner, watching you work 18-hour days, celebrating your successes, comforting you when Brad disappointed you again. 5 years of watching him take credit for your achievements while gambling away your profits behind your back. James reached across the table and took my hand. "I was never going to steal from you, Lucy. I was trying to figure out how to save you without destroying your marriage. But then Brad's gambling debts started attracting dangerous people, and I realized that protecting your money meant protecting your life." I looked at Brad, really looked at him, and saw the truth written across his guilty face. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the financial pressure he'd mentioned. It hadn't been about wanting someone younger. It had been about owing money to people who broke kneecaps when they didn't get paid. "How much does he owe?" I asked. "Almost $500,000, with interest accumulating daily," James replied. "And Lucy, the people he owes aren't the kind who accept payment plans." That's when I realized that my cheating husband wasn't just unfaithful and weak. He was dangerous. He'd put me, my company, and potentially my life at risk to fund his gambling addiction. But James Richardson, the man I'd been preparing to destroy for theft, had actually been protecting me all along. The federal investigation, the offshore accounts, even his convenient presence during my marriage crisis. It had all been part of an elaborate plan to save me from my own husband. And now I had to decide what to do with that information. 3 months later, I was sitting in my office, the one with the panoramic view of downtown and the Monet original on the wall, reviewing the quarterly reports for Morrison Tech's most profitable year in company history. The offshore accounts James had established had been reintegrated into our domestic holdings, plus the 14% annual growth they'd accumulated while hidden in Swiss banks. Brad was somewhere in Nevada, living in a studio apartment and working construction. The divorce settlement had been remarkably simple once his gambling debts came to light. He'd signed away any claim to Morrison Tech, the house or our joint assets, in exchange for me covering his debts to avoid what his creditors had described as permanent physical adjustment to his facial features. The affair with Amber, it turned out, had been his pathetic attempt to find someone who might help him financially. She dumped him the moment she realized he was broke instead of rich. Some women have excellent survival instincts. James knocked on my office door, carrying 2 cups of the expensive coffee he'd insisted on installing in our break room. "How are the numbers looking?" "Like we should celebrate," I replied, accepting my coffee and gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from my desk. He'd been remarkably patient over the past 3 months, never pushing, never demanding answers about where we stood personally. He'd simply been the same competent, caring business partner he'd always been. Except now I knew why he'd always seemed so invested in my success. "James," I said, "we need to talk about what happens now. With the company? With us." He set down his coffee cup carefully, like a man preparing for disappointment. "Lucy, I want you to know that I never expected anything. Protecting you was the right thing to do, regardless of how I felt." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm considering it." "Considering what?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city I'd conquered one business deal at a time. Considering whether a woman who spent 20 years married to the wrong man might be ready to try dating the right one. The silence behind me stretched long enough that I turned around to make sure James hadn't fainted. He was staring at me with the kind of hope that would have been heartbreaking if it hadn't been so perfectly matched by the possibility blooming in my own chest. "Are you asking me out, Lucy Morrison?" "I'm asking if you'd like to have dinner somewhere that isn't a clandestine meeting about corporate fraud." James stood up, crossing the office until he was standing close enough that I could smell his cologne, the expensive kind that suggested competence rather than desperation. "I've been waiting 5 years to hear you ask that question," he said. "And I've been waiting 5 years to meet a man who valued protecting me more than possessing me." That's when he kissed me, right there in my office with the city sprawling below us and Morrison Tech's quarterly profits glowing on my computer screen. It was the kind of kiss that tasted like new beginnings and felt like coming home to a place you'd never been before. When we broke apart, James was smiling with the kind of joy that made him look 10 years younger. "So," I said, straightening his tie with mock seriousness, Our first official date. Where should we go? Anywhere but that restaurant where you confronted me about federal fraud, he replied. I'd prefer our romantic history not include quite so many mentions of Swiss banking laws. I laughed, remembering the look of terror on his face when I'd accused him of theft. You know, for a moment there, I thought I was going to have to destroy you. Lucy, he said, taking my hands in his, you couldn't destroy me if you tried. You're the reason I rebuilt myself into someone worth protecting you. 6 months later, Morrison Tech announced its merger with Richardson International Holdings, the company James had rebuilt after Victoria Chen cleared his name and helped him recover his stolen assets. Our combined company was now worth $87 million, and I was the CEO of the largest woman-owned tech firm in the state. Brad sent a congratulatory text when he saw the announcement. I didn't reply, but I did appreciate that he'd finally learned when to stay quiet. The wedding planning was scheduled to begin next month. James had proposed in the same restaurant where I'd confronted him about the supposed theft, because he said every great love story deserved a location with dramatic irony. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing contracts and sipping wine from the bottle James had brought to celebrate our latest client acquisition, I realized something important. For 20 years, I'd thought marriage meant compromising, adapting, making myself smaller to accommodate someone else's weaknesses. But the right partnership wasn't about becoming less. It was about becoming more successful, more confident, more authentically yourself than you ever thought possible. Brad had wanted me to pack my bags and leave his house. Instead, I'd kept my empire and found a man who wanted to help me expand it. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's about building a life so magnificent that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. And sometimes the best revenge is simply living well enough that their opinions no longer matter. 3 years later, when Brad sent a LinkedIn request asking to reconnect, I declined it without a second thought. Not out of anger, but out of indifference. When you're building an empire with someone who deserves to be part of it, you don't have time to look backward at the people who never appreciated what they had. After all, boring wives don't build dynasties, but determined women? We build whatever we want.